So, what can planners do about all this? How can they incorporate the lessons of these distinguished scientists into day-to-day decision-making and the making of urban environments? Not an easy question. I think it's very good that we're talking about planning here in the urban infrastructure section of this fantastic expo, because planning is a form of infrastructure. It's part of the regulatory framework. And in thinking about the scope of planning, it's helpful also to follow the speakers and recognize that scale applies to planning as well as to climate. So we scale our planning efforts at the scale of the city, at the scale of the neighborhood, and ultimately at the scale of the building, which is where development control and the engagement with architects, designers, and developments comes into play. The point is that all three of these scales are relevant climatically, and maybe it needs to be underlined that the city itself is a climate zone. The microclimate of the city is distinct from the surrounding region, and all of the meteorological variables differ as soon as one comes into an urban area, a built-up area. So, in one way or another, there are many factors for planners to take into account. And there is a parallelism here demonstrated in this very simple slide by the Chinese expert Chao Ren of the Hong Kong University. There's a parallelism between the scales of science and meteorology and the scales at which planners work. Okay, so let's just take those three scales and look at them one by one and ask what are the planning tools available. And in this, I'm going to be global. I'm not going to talk about the UK particularly. I'm going to end up talking about the UK when it comes to limitations. First, if we look at the urban scale, the city, as I've said, is a climatic fact. The boundaries of the built-up area correspond with a distinct climatic zone. And planners have recognized this by developing climate maps, or as it's called, Klimaatlases, particularly in Germany, first developed in Stuttgart, but now applied practically every German city has a climate map, and there's a German national engineering standard which specifies the variables to be taken into account and the ways in which those climatic facts are expressed cartographically, and the sort of lessons that would be derived for planners. So here, for example, is the Klimaatlas for Frankfurt am Main. And the sort of things which will show up on a climate map are where the high ground, for example, has pockets of cool air, which, if they're not blocked by buildings, can flow down into the streets at night and can flush out the daily pollution, or sea breezes, or many, many different variables can be expressed cartographically and affect decisions of where and what we build, which is where the planners have to get into work. Now this tool, the Klimaatlas, as somebody said, I think it was Sue Grimond, has been also, and it was Richard indeed in his introductory remarks, has been taken up and is widely applied in Southeast Asia. So first of all in Japan, here for example is the climate map for Yokohama, prepared by the environmental team in the planning department of Yokohama, and now increasingly Chinese cities in that hot, humid central belt that Sue Grimond showed on her map. The city officials are developing climate maps which try to ease the burden of climate management at a fundamental level by deciding where in this very rapidly urbanizing environment one can and cannot build. Let's come on to the neighborhood scale. Now, there are also planning techniques for assessing the environmental quality of urban design. But as soon as you start to take the lid off those techniques, and it's done in a recent article published in the Environmental Impact Assessment Review, as soon as you take the lid off those techniques, you discover just how many variables there are in assessing the environmental performance of a neighbourhood. I mean, look at this show. Think of water, think of materials, think of global mitigation factors such as energy consumption, think of global adaptation factors such as flood defense or resilience in disaster. And you realize that the list of variables is 50 long. And what we're doing, if we're talking about microclimate, is pitching in albedo and shading and the other factors which are of interest to us from the microclimatic analysis. So it's a complex thing, this thinking of neighbourhood. There is a whole load of measures in this central column, and the take-home message is that only one of them, which is the Japanese CASB tool, so that CASB tool developed in Tsukuba Science City, that does include microclimatic performance of neighbourhoods, but most of them don't. Once you're talking about neighbourhoods, it's possible to model them. And Agnesi showed you one of the models, which is freeware. It's software which is widely available. It doesn't require a university project to access it. NVMet, developed in Mainz by a German scientist and continually updated. And it's a very sophisticated software which enables you to take the design of any neighbourhood and feed in variables such as topography, ground cover, vegetation, buildings, water. And Agnesi's presentation reminded us that in fact you can feed in all the different materials of all the houses in a neighbourhood and the colour that they're painted, and that will affect the performance of the model and the meteorological output. So much for the neighbourhood scale. Let's come down now to the scale which is where most planning occurs, and that's the street and the building scale. Now, it's true that every building requires permission, and every neighbourhood, every part of Britain is in some way mapped on a plan. So it does offer opportunities to influence microclimate through design improvement. And looking again to Southeast Asia, we can see the Hong Kong Building Council have 31 strategies which try to correlate climatic variables, wind, thermal, radiation, temperature, precipitation, with design variables. But again, I have to say that this isn't a very upbeat presentation, because the interface between design and planning is generally through what's called an environmental impact analysis. You can have freestanding reports, but actually it's much more likely to go into an EIA. And EIA consultants won't incorporate microclimatic modelling unless it's very explicitly required to do so in what's called the scoping process. Scoping process looks at 100 different variables and says, in this case, we require you to look at this or that variable. Now, Julie Futcher wasn't quite right, I'm afraid to say, when she said that it is not true that in London you're required to take account of the climatic impact of buildings. In fact, several London boroughs have statutory policies, and indeed so does the London Mayor. So both at the citywide scale, the GLA scale, and in terms of the individual boroughs, there are policies which require climatic assessment to be incorporated in the scopes of a building, and that's a part of the initial screening decision which decides what variables would be there. And in fact, even as we speak, the Sadiq Khan, his new plan for London is under discussion in City Hall, and that's got a rather more elaborate set of policies for buildings which are likely to have a major climatic impact, and requires them to be modelled for their environmental impact. And this plan is very likely to be adopted next year. But that's London. Elsewhere in Britain, I'd say that the performance is very uneven. So, for example, Manchester and Salford, undergoing at present a tall building boom, has no mechanism for environmental scrutiny. And this is paradoxical, that the city which aims to be at the very forefront of climate change issues, aiming to achieve zero carbon by the year 2038, has no screening requirement for environmental assessment, no scoping guidance for the variables that should be looked at in climatic assessment. So to conclude, the limitations of planning are very evident. Plans are very rarely designed from scratch. Most planning is about regulation and policy working at the margin, and at the margin, climate is just one concern amongst many. Climate is set within a bundle of policies which are framed at several levels of government, and the generally neoliberal environment makes it harder and harder. It means that local authorities have a financial pressure on them that means they're inclined to say yes. So in conclusion, can climate-led design be a planning tool for livable places? I would say no. Tool is the wrong word. At best, you're adding another ingredient to a bubbling stew pot, which is already overfull and brimming at the rim. So the only way in which we can push climate up the agenda is to make politicians, the decision-makers, aware that this matters. And of course, what's most likely to make them aware of it is disaster. And the only question is whether we can improve our climate sensitivity, our climate leadership, before disaster strikes. Thank you very much.